I'm Maya Thorne. I'm 30 years old and I'm a prosecutor here in Sedona, Arizona. My entire life, my entire career has been built on one foundation: the integrity taught to me by my grandfather, Judge Julian Thorne. He was one of Arizona's most renowned judges, a man who defined justice for this state. He's been gone just weeks, and today, my parents, Mark and Claire, served me with a lawsuit. Their claim? That I used undue influence to manipulate an elderly, frail man. That I seized his entire $5 million estate. The words blur on the page. Heat climbs my spine, my jaw locking until it aches. My parents, the two people who abandoned me on my grandparents' doorstep when I was 1 year old, are painting me as the thief. How could they? But they made one critical mistake. At the will reading, my father was so disgusted that his only inheritance was, in his words, an old diary, that he threw it on the floor. I didn't say a word. I just calmly bent down and picked it up. It was the only evidence I would ever need. How do you defend justice when the ones trying to destroy you are your own parents? If you've ever felt betrayed by the people who should have protected you, you're going to want to hear this. Please subscribe and let me tell you what happened. My father, Mark Thorne, was a basketball star. He was tall, charming, and a high-earning athlete who toured the country. My mother, Claire, was a sharp, ambitious reporter with golden hair and a voice that could silence a room. They were a glittering couple, at least on the surface, living fast, loving passionately, and spending money like it was water. But I didn't belong in their world. I was the accident they never planned for. The story, as my grandfather told it, is simple. When I was 1 year old, they showed up at my grandparents' home on the outskirts of Sedona. They left me with a small bag of clothes and a vague promise to return for me soon. They never did. I was left behind, like an unimportant piece of luggage. And so, I became part of a different home. The home of Judge Julian Thorne and his wife, Elena, my grandparents. Their house wasn't large or luxurious. It sat at the end of a quiet road, surrounded by towering pines and a garden full of wildflowers. But it was always warm, as if their love had seeped into the very bricks. My grandfather, Julian, was the renowned judge. He was tall and lean, with silver hair and deep brown eyes that seemed to see right through you, searching for the truth. He was a strict man, but he never made me feel afraid. He made me feel safe, as if, as long as he was there, the world could never fall apart. My grandmother, Elena, was the heart of that home. She was petite, with a gentle smile and hands that were always busy, kneading dough for bread, pruning plants in the garden. She would sing old folk songs while she worked, and she taught me how to make her cornbread, how to plant sunflower seeds. She taught me how to care for others, not just with actions, but as she would say, with your heart. My childhood was built in that house, surrounded by those two people. Evenings were my favorite. We'd be in the living room. The air would be still, smelling faintly of old books and pine. My grandfather would sit under the glow of a single lamp, reading his thick law books, and I would sit across from him at the old wooden chessboard. Its pieces were chipped, worn smooth by his fingers. He taught me to play on that board. He always let me go first. But he never, ever let me win. You have to learn to fight fair, Maya, he'd say, his eyes twinkling as he captured my queen again. It wasn't about strategy. Not really. Those games taught me patience. They taught me the importance of thinking before acting and of taking responsibility for every single move I made. But not everything was sunshine and cornbread. There were moments, often at night. I'd lie in my small bed, in my small room, and wonder, where were they? What were they doing? Why didn't they want me? Those questions were like small, sharp stones, piling up in my heart. They made me feel like a puzzle piece that didn't fit anywhere. One evening, when I was about 7, I was sitting at that old chessboard. The living room was quiet, except for the sound of the Sedona wind whispering through the pines outside. I held a small wooden pawn in my hand, turning it over and over. The plastic felt smooth and cool. For years, that question had haunted me. Why? Finally, I looked up at my grandfather. His brow was furrowed as he studied the board. I mustered every ounce of courage in my 7-year-old body. Grandpa? He looked up, his eyes kind. Yes, Maya? My voice was barely a whisper. Why aren't my parents here with me? The room went completely still. I could hear the tick of the mantel clock. He didn't answer right away. His hand, which had been hovering over a night, froze in midair. He didn't look sad. He didn't offer me pity, which I think would have broken me. He just looked sincere. He met my gaze. I felt my chest tighten, the air suddenly too thick to breathe. My heart was pounding, a small, frantic drum against my ribs. Maya, he said, his voice low and steady. In this world, some people choose to live for themselves. They chase joy, or freedom, or whatever it is that makes them feel alive. He paused, and his eyes held mine. Your parents. They chose their own path. I waited, hardly breathing. That was the L3 spike, the moment the truth hits, cold and sharp. Then, he set the knight down on the board. A solid, definitive click. But you, he said, his voice softening just a little. You are here, and we chose you. He didn't erase the pain. He didn't lie and say they'd be back. He gave me something better. He gave me the truth, and he gave me a new identity. Those words etched themselves into my mind. I wasn't an abandoned child. I was a chosen child. My entire understanding of the world shifted on that axis. The wound was still there, but it wasn't a void anymore. It was a scar. And it taught me the single most important lesson of my life. Family isn't about blood. It's about the people who choose to stay. Years passed. I was 14. My grandparents were my entire world. Then, one afternoon, a loud, firm knock echoed through the house. My grandmother, Elena, and I looked at each other. We weren't expecting anyone. I opened the door. And there they were, Mark and Claire, my parents. They looked like movie stars. My father, still tall and athletic. My mother, beautiful, her blonde hair perfect, her blue eyes cold. The hug was brief, awkward. It was more like a formality than affection. A brush of expensive-smelling clothes against my cheek. You've grown so much, Maya, my mother said. But her gaze, it slid right past me, as if I were just a piece of furniture in the entryway. They didn't stay long. And they didn't ask about me. They didn't ask about school, or my friends, or the chess games. They sat in the living room, my grandfather's living room, and they talked about their struggles. A failed investment, a canceled endorsement deal, a debt that needed to be paid, urgently. My mother, her voice sweet but sharp, asked my grandfather for a small loan, just to help them get through this phase. My grandfather Julian listened, his expression unchanging, but I saw his hand grip the arm of his chair. He gave them the money. After that, they came more frequently. And each time, the story was the same. Forced smiles, half-hearted apologies, and another request for money. I began to realize the painful truth. They only came to see my grandparents when they needed something. My father's refrain became a sick, familiar song. Dad, I just need this one last time, I promise. One autumn night when I was 16, the Sedona wind blew so fiercely that the windows rattled in their frames. I had gone to bed, but I couldn't sleep. The wind was too loud. And then I heard his voice. My father's. Sharp. Cutting through the sound of the storm. I tiptoed down the hallway, my feet cold on the wooden floor. I stood behind the slightly open living room door, my heart pounding in my chest. I shouldn't be listening. I knew I shouldn't. Mark stood in the middle of the room, his face flushed. You always think you're right, don't you? He shouted. You'd rather sit on your judge's bench and cling to your money than help your own son. My grandfather Julian sat in his armchair. His voice was low, but it was heavy with a pain that terrified me. Mark, he said, and his voice trembled just slightly. I've given you everything I could, but you chose your path, a path that had no room for Maya. You left your daughter. And now you come here, not to see her, but because you only need money. The air went silent, sucked out of the room. My father just stared at him. The sound of the wind howling outside was the only reply. Then, I heard his heavy footsteps. The front door opened, and he slammed it shut. The slam was so hard it felt like the house itself shuddered. I crept out from my hiding place. My grandfather was still sitting in his chair. He wasn't looking at the door. He was just staring. His shoulders were trembling. I realized, for the first time, he wasn't trembling from fear. He was trembling from the deep, agonizing pain of failing to change his own son. He was the strongest man I knew, and he was powerless against this. Time moved on. I was 18, applying to law schools, trying to build a future. But as I was looking forward, my grandmother was fading. Elena's health, always fragile, began to fail. Her gentle smile was still there, but her cough worsened. I'd find her in the garden, pausing to catch her breath, one hand pressed to her chest. "I'm all right, Maya," she'd say, waving me off. "I just need a little rest." But my grandfather and we were terrified. That storm arrived on a fierce winter night. The wind howled again, a soundtrack to the drama I knew was coming. A knock. It was Mark. He was demanding money again, more than ever before. This time, Julian refused. "Mark, I can't," he said, his voice firm. "I can't keep doing this." "What do you mean you can't?" Mark's voice rose, sharp and desperate. My grandmother Elena stepped between them, her small frame looking so frail. She put a hand on my father's arm. "Mark, please," she begged, her voice a thin whisper. "No more arguing. We're family." "Family?" Mark scoffed. But before he could say another word, Elena's face went white, a gasp. She clutched her chest, her eyes wide with a terror I had never seen. And she collapsed. "Grandma!" I screamed, rushing forward. My grandfather lunged, catching her before she hit the floor. "Elena, my love, stay with me." His voice cracked, breaking with a fear that ripped through me. I looked at my father. Mark. He just stood there, frozen. His eyes glanced down at his mother, collapsing on the floor, as if she were merely an obstacle. And then, he said it. The words that will echo in my mind until the day I die. "I don't have time for this." My grandfather was pleading for his wife's life. I was screaming, my hands fumbling for my phone to call 911. And my father, Mark Thorne, turned his back on us. He walked out. The door slammed shut, leaving us in a deadly, suffocating silence, broken only by my grandfather's frantic whispers and the wail of the wind. The wail of the sirens. That's all I remember. The red lights flashing, painting the pine trees and the front of our house in rhythmic, terrifying strokes of red. In the ambulance, I held my grandfather's hand. It was ice cold, and it was trembling. This was Julian Thorne, the judge. The man who was my mountain, my immovable object, the man who stared down murderers and never flinched, and he was trembling like a leaf. He just kept whispering her name, Elena. Elena. Stay with me. He was powerless. And I knew, in that moment, that I had lost her. The hospital was worse. It was all fluorescent lights and the smell of antiseptic, a cold, sterile white that felt like the opposite of my grandmother's warm, flour-dusted kitchen. We sat on cold metal chairs in a waiting room that felt too small. Time stopped. It stretched and warped, every second an agonizing, silent scream. I don't know how many hours passed. 2, 3. Finally, a doctor in scrubs emerged, his face drawn. He looked at my grandfather, and his eyes were full of a tired sorrow. He didn't have to say the words. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice low. "We did everything we could. Her heart, it was just too weak." My grandfather didn't cry. He just deflated, as if the bones had been pulled from his body. He just nodded, once. And a part of him died right there in that hallway, under those buzzing fluorescent lights. The funeral was held in the small church in Sedona, the one my grandmother loved, the one with the stained glass windows that she said caught the sunlight just right. It was full. The entire town, it seemed. People she had fed, people my grandfather had helped, people whose lives she had touched with her quiet kindness. The air was heavy with the scent of lilies and whispered condolences. I stood at the front, next to my grandfather. He was a statue in his black suit. I watched him as he stared at her casket, and for the first time in my entire life, I saw my grandfather cry. Silent tears, just, rolling down his weathered face. It felt like my own heart was breaking into pieces to watch him. And in that crowded church, 2 seats remained conspicuously empty. My parents, Mark and Claire, were nowhere to be found. I had called. I had left frantic, pleading voicemails. "Grandma is gone. The funeral is on Tuesday. Please, please, just come." For her, their voicemail remained silent. Their absence wasn't just an oversight, it wasn't a mistake, it was a final, severing knife. They didn't just abandon me as a child. They abandoned my grandmother in her final moment, and they abandoned my grandfather in his deepest grief. My grandfather's old friend, Frank Bennett, a retired lawyer, came up to us. He put a hand on my shoulder and one on Julian's. He looked at me, his eyes full of a righteous anger. "They don't deserve you, Maya," he whispered, his voice thick, "and they certainly didn't deserve Elena." A few weeks after the funeral, my grandfather called me into his study, the room where we'd played chess. He sat down at his desk, but he didn't look at his law books. He looked at me. "Maya," he said, his voice clear, but hollow. "I've submitted my resignation. I'm retiring from the bench." "What, Grandpa? No, you can't." He held up a hand, his eyes. They were haunted. "A man who couldn't protect the one he loved," he said, his voice breaking, "no longer has the right to sit on that bench." It cut me to the core. He truly believed he had failed. He, the man who had saved me, felt he had failed the one person he loved most. I moved into his study with him. I became his anchor, just as he had been mine. I listened to his stories. I made him eat. And in those long, dark months, a vow took root in my heart, a cold, hard promise. He felt he had failed. I would not. I would continue the path of justice he had walked. I would become the person he had always taught me to be. I would protect those who couldn't protect themselves. I would not fail. I earned a full scholarship to Arizona State University for law school. My grandfather offered to pay for everything, but I refused. This was my path, my vow. I had to walk it myself. I had to earn it. Those 6 years were a trial by fire. I worked 2 jobs to cover my books and my rent. I'd finish a shift waitressing at 2 a.m., my shoes sticky with spilled soda, and head to the university library to shelve books until my eyes burned. I ran on 3 hours of sleep, sheer will, and gallons of black coffee. I was forging myself into a weapon, just as he had taught me. But I was never alone. Not really. Every week, a letter would arrive, handwritten on pale yellow legal paper. His penmanship, once so bold and precise, was getting a little shaky. But his mind was as sharp as ever. He didn't just write about the weather, he sent me lessons. He wrote about ethics, about cases he'd tried decades ago, about the true meaning of justice. "Justice is not a destination, Maya," he wrote in one letter I still keep. "It's a journey, and sometimes it will break your heart, but you must never stop walking." Those letters were a flame in the dark. The day I graduated, I stood on the stage, my name echoing in the auditorium. I looked out at the sea of faces, and I found him. He was sitting in the 3rd row, wearing his old black suit, the one he always wore for important court dates. And he was smiling. I mean, really smiling. A smile that reached his eyes. It was the first time I had seen him truly smile since Elena died. When I stepped down, he hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. He just held me and whispered in my ear, "Your grandmother. Oh, Maya. She would be so proud." I came home. I passed the bar, and I was hired as a deputy prosecutor for Sedona. I moved back into the old house on the quiet road. Back to him. Our old routine returned, but it was different. Our evenings were spent at that chipped, weathered chessboard. But now, I brought him my early cases. I'd read him the files, the facts, the ethical dilemmas I was facing. We'd sit under the warm lamplight, drinking cold tea, the scent of old books and pine in the air. He'd listen, nodding slowly. And he gave me his final, most important lesson. "Being a prosecutor isn't about winning, Maya," he said one evening, his eyes fixed on the board. "It's not about the notches on your belt. It's about protecting what's right, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Never forget that." One morning, a few months later, I came downstairs. The house was quiet. Too quiet. There was no sound of him turning the pages of the newspaper, no faint cough from the living room. "Grandpa?" I walked into the living room. He was sitting in his armchair by the window, the one that caught the morning light, looking out at the garden Elena had planted. His old leather-bound diary was resting on his lap. He had passed away, peacefully, in his sleep. My knees buckled. I knelt beside his chair, my hand shaking as I touched his. It was cold. I laid my head on his lap, and for the first time since I was a child, I felt utterly, completely lost. After a long time, my hands shaking, I picked up the diary. I opened it to the last page. His handwriting, once so strong, was now a frail tremble, but the words were clear. They were his last will and testament to me. True justice isn't found in the courtroom, but in the hearts of those who keep believing in it. The funeral was hard. But I got through it, focusing on his legacy. 2 weeks later, we all gathered for the reading of the will, the set piece for the final betrayal. We were in David Chen's office. Mr. Chen had been my grandfather's attorney and friend for 40 years. The room was exactly what you'd expect. Dark wood walls, shelves lined with thick, leather-bound books, and the air filled with the dry, comforting smell of old paper. I sat on one side of his large mahogany desk, and on the other side, sat Mark and Claire. My parents. They were dressed in expensive black, looking more like they were attending a business merger than a reading of a will. Their eyes were sharp, expectant. They were anticipating their prize. Mr. Chen cleared his throat, the sound of him unfolding the document rustling in the quiet room. He began to read. He went through the usual legal language, and then he got to the heart of it. All my assets, including the house in Sedona, all land, stocks, and savings, totaling approximately $5 million. I bequeathed to my granddaughter, Maya Thorne. My mother's sharp intake of breath was the only sound. I felt nothing, just a stillness. Mr. Chen continued. Julian also left a personal note. It reads, "I trust that only this granddaughter understands the value of integrity and will know what to do with what I have left." I closed my eyes. "A quiet thank you." "And," Mr. Chen said, looking up at my father, "to my son, Mark Thorne, I leave." My father leaned forward, his whole body tense. My diary. The silence in that room was absolute. It stretched for 1 second, 2. My father's face, which had been pale with anticipation, turned a dark, blotchy red. A diary?" he stammered. And then he roared. "A diary? He left me an old notebook? After everything? I'll sue!" He shot up from his chair, his voice echoing off the walls. Before Mr. Chen could say a word, Mark snatched the small, leather-bound book from the desk and, in a fit of pure, childish rage, threw it. It hit the floor with a soft, sickening thud. The room went silent again. My mother looked horrified, not at his grief, but at his display. Mr. Chen looked appalled. My heart wasn't pounding. It was cold, calm. This was the man who had abandoned me, the man who had left his own mother to die on the floor. And now, he was throwing away the last piece of his father. I didn't say a word. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I stood up, calmly bent down and picked up the diary. The worn leather was cool in my hands. I held it to my chest. This was his legacy. This was my grandfather's final lesson, and it was my evidence. True to his word, he sued. They both did. The claim, undue influence. The headlines in the Sedona paper were humiliating. Judge, S.O.N., Suez, daughter, over $5M estate. I, a prosecutor, was accused of manipulating an elderly, frail man. The D.A.'s office had no choice. They had to suspend me pending the outcome. The trial was a blur, but I'll never forget the judge, Michael Grayson. He was a man in his late 50s, with sharp eyes. Eyes I recognized. He had clerked for my grandfather decades ago. He knew Julian Thorne. He knew his integrity. My parents' lawyer painted me as a gold-digging opportunist. And then, David Chen took the stand. He presented the will. And then, he presented the diary. He read my grandfather's words aloud. Passages detailing Mark's endless demands for money. Passages describing his disappointment. And then, the passages about me. About our chess games. About law school. About his unwavering absolute trust in me. The courtroom was silent. Judge Grayson listened to it all. He reviewed the evidence, and then he delivered his verdict. He looked at me. Then he looked at my parents. He dismissed their suit in its entirety. His final words hit them like a gavel. This court finds no evidence of undue influence. It only finds evidence of integrity being rewarded. He looked directly at Mark. Justice, Mr. Thorne, does not side with blood, it sides with truth. The courtroom emptied, the sound of Judge Grayson's words still hanging in the air. Justice sides with truth. My parents were the last to leave. Claire was gathering her expensive coat, her face a tight mask of fury and shame. Mark just sat there, motionless, staring at the empty witness stand. I had restored the diary. I had carefully taped the torn pages and cleaned the leather cover. It was in my briefcase. I walked over and stood in front of my father. He slowly looked up, his eyes empty. I held out the diary. "You should read this," I said. My voice wasn't angry, it was just steady. Not to apologize, not for me, but so you can finally understand why Grandpa never stopped loving you. I was setting a boundary. I wasn't offering forgiveness. I was offering him a path to his own. Mark looked at the diary, then at my face. His hand, when he reached for it, was trembling. His fingers brushed mine, and they were cold. He took the book. He didn't say a word. He just nodded, a small, broken gesture. Claire grabbed his arm, and without looking at me, they walked out of the courtroom, leaving me alone with my grandfather's truth. The town of Sedona, which had revered Judge Julian Thorne, did not forget. The karmic justice was swift. The community, which had been my silent, found family all along, turned on my parents with a quiet, collective force. I was reinstated at the DA's office, and when I went to the local market, Rosa, the flower vendor who had known my grandmother for 30 years, took my hand. "We heard what happened, Maya," she said, her eyes fierce. "Your parents, they're a disgrace to Julian's name." I heard stories. Other shop owners, people who had been friends with my grandparents, refused to serve them. They were shunned. They had come to claim an inheritance, and in the process, they had lost the one thing they couldn't buy, the respect of their hometown. I poured myself back into my work, but I wasn't the same. I was my grandfather's legacy. I handled the small cases, the ones that usually get lost in the system, but I handled them with his words in my mind. It's about protecting what's right. I handled the case of a young woman, Elena, accused of shoplifting. It turned out she was stealing baby formula. I saw a path to rehabilitation, not just punishment. I handled the case of an elderly man, Jorge, who was being evicted unjustly. I heard my grandfather's voice, telling me to fight fair, and I used my power as a prosecutor to protect him. I wasn't just upholding the law. I was serving justice, the way Julian had defined it. I was in my apartment one night, late, surrounded by case files. My phone buzzed. An unfamiliar number. I answered. Thorne. A long silence. Then, a voice, raspy and broken. "Maya?" My blood went cold. It was Mark. I read the diary," he said, his voice thick, as if he were choking back a sob. This time, I read it all. I sat down, gripping the phone. "I saw myself," he whispered, in his words. I saw what I was. A failed son, a failed father. He was right about everything. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Maya. I know I don't deserve it. I know that." He took a ragged breath. "But I hope. I'm just calling to hope for a chance. A chance to just start over." I thought of Julian. I thought of Elena. I thought of the little girl at the chessboard, wondering why she wasn't wanted. The anger, the cold, hard vow I had made. It just dissolved. "I don't know if I can forgive yet," I said, and my own voice was steady. "That's a long road." "I know," he said quickly. "But I know one thing," I continued. "I know Grandpa would smile if he saw you trying." I hung up. I walked to my balcony and stood in the cool Sedona night air. The town was quiet, the stars brilliant above the red rocks. I held my grandfather's diary, its worn leather cover feeling like his hand in mine. I finally understood his last words. True justice isn't a verdict handed down by a judge. It's not about winning or losing. It's found in the hearts of those who keep believing. It's the moment a father finally understands. It's the moment a daughter lets go of the rage. It's the quiet, steady choice to protect what's right. My grandparents taught me that family isn't about blood. Blood is just a fact. Family is a choice. It's about the people who choose to stay, the people who choose to fight for you, the people who choose you. If you've ever felt like a puzzle piece that didn't fit, remember that. You get to choose your family. You get to build your own legacy. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe. It means the world to us.